I like that.
Hello, everybody. I know quite how to do this.
Just keep talking.
Just keep talking? Okay.
Sure.
Well, this is the beginning of the second part of the presentation. And is this correct?
Yeah, let's say that's good.
And we are basically a group of engineering and anthropology students, and we sat together and we just kind of discussed on how each of us chooses a community to work with. And we came up with this presentation. In the beginning, it will outline what's different about how we chose a community, anthropologists and engineers. Then we talk a little bit about what's similar. And then each of us will give one example about how we chose a community to work with, either for research or to implement an engineering project. And then in the end, we will discuss about what we all can learn and what we have just learned from discussing ideas on how we chose a community. So the beginning of this presentation is just going to go into how engineers ordinarily choose a community. They don't always do it that way, but that's kind of how we came up that they ordinarily do that. Oh, thanks.
You got completely what I had.
I don't have those when I'm a TA, so that's helpful. All right, so it passes
All
on to you.
right, thank you. So, hi, I'm Anne, PhD student in agricultural engineering. So these are just some things that I think are generalities. Oh, thank you for following.
Yeah.
Generalities about how engineering students or engineering projects are typically find a community. And I think the first one is usually need as informed by a key informant. So someone in the community says, we have a problem here and we need someone to come work on a project in this particular place, whether it be water or food security or energy or what have you. Someone says, the problem is right here, you need to come fix it right here for us. Priorities can also sometimes be set by funding agencies. So a lot of times we apply for grants, and the grants are specific about where we should be working. We should be working in these list of 10 priority countries that have been identified by some funding agency, or this particular kind of community, or a community that has one of these particular kinds of offices in it that we want to liaise with. And that kind of limits where exactly you can be working. Another constraint on how we typically choose communities is oftentimes logistical convenience. And there are certainly some challenges and biases associated with that. We don't want to send students particularly, to some place that's out in the middle of nowhere if they have an emergency or crises. Especially undergraduate students, we'd like to be able to get them back out of there in a reasonable amount of time. So we like to find places that are easy to get to, easy to get them back out in case there was some, urgent situation. And it's also cheaper too, right? If you're flying into some place and you just need ground transportation near to where that airport was, instead of hiring a car to drive you 8 hours across the country, that makes things a little bit more convenient to do projects. Generally, and this is just a generality again, but engineers are typically first introduced to a community, and then there's like some level of acquaintance with the community, and then the project is developed. So that's pretty straightforward. And then oftentimes engineering students inherit projects with locations already selected. Patrick's going to give a good example of that, where a lot of times we work on either these projects like EPIC, CWB, Global Design Teams, these kinds of projects where maybe the community was selected 5 years ago, and you don't know why that community in particular was maybe chosen. So I think Patrick in particular during his talk is going to give us some things to consider. How that can be easier, how that can be more difficult, and some things you want to keep in mind when you're working on a project where you have a long-standing relationship, for better or worse.
All right. So then we talked a little bit about how anthropologists ordinarily choose a community. There we go. So oftentimes a community fits into a general cultural interest area. It's not like we necessarily start with the community, but we start developing some kind of framework that has to do with a regional area in general, professional interests. Maybe a certain framework, a certain intellectual question has sparked our intellectual curiosity, or we think it advances the theory. And we hope that we can somehow figure out how societies and cultures function and work, and we develop a framework, and then from that framework on we narrow it down and we go to a community. Now that's mostly the case, but it's not necessarily always the case. Sometimes you also have cultural insiders who start a study on a certain community, and they've always been around. But more often than not, we start with a certain region, and then within that region we specify in which community we want to work in. With the engineers, it's oftentimes the other way around. They really start with the community. What also dictates where we can and cannot go is knowledge of language and culture. If somebody always took classes on West Africa, this person would not choose a community in Southeast Asia. So the immersion into language and culture long before somebody ever, set foot into a community is something that anthropologists often prioritize. Funding is also an issue. We might not want it, but oftentimes funding priorities kind of also influence where we do our work. If there's a lot of funding in Asian countries, then more people are probably going to direct their research interests into that area. Maybe it's a little more indirect than with the engineers, but it certainly also exists. And then, of course, one of the most important aspects is community access, which is what we focus on in this presentation. Can we go to the community? Does the community want us? That is majorly important. And then I think one other thing that we wanted to add to this is chance. A lot of anthropologists are in a community due to chance. They might have traveled and then they really liked the place. Actually, one of the most famous anthropologists, Malinowski, got stuck on an island for a long time, Trobriand Islands, and that's where he did his study. And even though it's much criticized, it's one of the first thorough anthropological studies. So when you talk with an anthropologist, more often than not, that person will have first developed her research project and determined a general cultural area, and then they would select a specific community that they wanted to work with. And yeah, that's most anthropologists that you'll meet. And we also thought about a few aspects that actually kind of dictate the work of both anthropologists and engineers, and that would be Aidan.
Hi, my name is Aidan. I'm a master's student in the Department of Anthropology. So there are some common influencing factors that we do see. So funding restrictions can be a really big problem, especially for anthropologists. Like Jonas said, it can dictate where we go, and it can also dictate how, not just specific places, but also just how far we can go in some places. Also, we're all restricted by an academic calendar if we're working with the university, and so those are things we have to consider is how long can our project last? Do we need to break it up into several different sections over periods of months or years? We're also affected by the climate. Some places do have rainy seasons, and that dictates when we can go, and also what our experiences are going to be like. There are laws, international and national laws, that dictate research, how research is carried out, how you interact with certain communities. There are irreconcilable cultural differences that can sometimes pop up, so it can be things like religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, that can create travel issues, or if there are laws that affect those identities. There can also be ethnic differences. Those are all things you have to consider when you're looking at a community. There's also safety, so like Anne was talking about, how fast can you get in and out of a community if something happens. That's something you have to account for and have risk plans and risk assessments made. Also access, it does affect safety as well. And for anthropologists, we do a lot of work with human subjects. We talk to people, and that's if you're with a university, it's regulated by something called the Institutional Review Board at the university. And so you have to give them a proposal of what you're planning to do, and a pretty specific one at that. And they have to approve it and say that it's not going to create, so that if there is any risk to the community or risk to people, that you've accounted for that, and that your main interest is protecting the people you're working with. And with that is also the risk for community. You have to be aware of what your project is risking for the community, what their involvement is going to be like, if there's any danger for them. Those things you always have to be aware of. All right, and next up we have Anne. and Anne's going to talk to you about her project.
So I've embarked on this couple-year research project about the use of treated wastewater in agriculture, primarily in the Middle East and North Africa, but I've also taken up a study site here in Indiana. So I'm just going to run through the 4 countries that I've been working in and how, first of all, I chose the countries, and then I came to find the specific sites that I'm working in. So kind of a quick overview of what this project is. I'm looking at, okay, wastewater treatment plants, public perception of using treated wastewater in agricultural production, and also an analysis of policy related to how people can reuse treated wastewater in their agricultural production, either at a household level or more at an industrial scale as well. So my first study site was Palestine. I chose that place, that country, or what do we want to call it, in general, because I'd had previous experience there. I knew the organization well, I'd worked with them for several years, and it was a natural fit. I knew that they were very interested in this topic in particular, so I was drawn to them for that. It also matched well with the grant requirements. The grant requirement was such that I needed to be working in a quote-unquote developing country with a particular sort of scientific partner, and everything fell into place there. It's also scientifically relevant because there were applications of treated wastewater reuse being actively used there, so it made sense from that standpoint. However, there are some challenges regarding safety and reliability. I mean reliability in the sense that if you are planning to do research there on a Tuesday and you woke up Tuesday morning and found out that there was a roadblock or something was shut down and you couldn't get there, you know, that really screws things up as far as I can't get to the lab that day, people are expecting me to be in their houses, I'm supposed to be at the farm, like I need to make a lot of phone calls. It can become very complicated and very stressful very quickly. So that was kind of a con in the country selection category. But I think all the other previous 3 outweighed that one. The site selections in general, I had a key informant working at the organization that I was collaborating with, and his family lived nearby. So this is maybe jumping ahead an entire workshop, but some of the biases you find when you find a key informant and they lead you in the direction of how to choose particular sites and particular communities. I went to that community because he knew the people there. His parents, his brothers, his sisters, his cousins all lived in this community, and it made sense for him. He wanted to go there. He wanted, you know, perhaps some service to be done for that community, and so that's where we went. But it was also relatively close to the office where I was working, so that was convenient. You know, we go back to that logistical convenience. And there were relatively few roadblocks or checkpoints along the way, which eased transportation. And finally, since the key informant knew the families, we knew the families would participate. We weren't going to get to a place where we knocked on the door and were like turned away. So we knew that we were probably going to get 100% participation in that place. So that was also a little bit of a problem if you're trying to do you know, a non-biased sort of research. But it was also comforting to know that the work was going to get done in a timely manner. Second study site is in Tunisia, and I chose this country kind of wasn't necessarily my choice, but it turned out that my advisor had a relationship with someone who was working in Tunisia, that was working in a laboratory there, had interest in this topic, and it just fell into place. It also matched with the grant requirement for the grant I was applying for to do the research. Coincidentally, it's also quite scientifically relevant. Tunisia reuses a lot of treated wastewater, made a really nice case study there as well. However, again, we have safety and reliability concerns. You know, revolution just a couple years ago, don't really know what the situation's going to be when I get there. And it was indeed quite interesting. A couple photos here illustrate that. Not the best, while scientifically relevant, not the best study sites ever, because after the revolution, the municipal facilities have not been upkept, basically. There's not been any employees working there for 2 years, trash has been piling up, things aren't operating the way they should. But it still makes an interesting story for the research. Site selection was chosen there in a slightly different way. The key informant did know the sites and was helpful in helping me find those. However, some challenges in where the government would let me go. They were a little sensitive about having a Westerner show up, so they didn't want me to see everything, so I basically got to see what they were willing to let me see. However, it was still a good project, and I think still good results will come from it. Third site is in Qatar. My advisor's currently working there, so it was very convenient. It made sense to go there. He had local access. He knows lots of other professionals and academics working there that he could introduce me to. However, it is difficult to access some facilities there. The authorities are not as open-minded about letting someone come in and just take samples and ask questions and see plans and historical data and things like that. So, I guess the cons always, you have to balance them with the pros. And the site selection again came, the key informant, that's your main person. That's your person that's going to help you get into places where, they already know someone, they know how the place operates, and can really ease access for you. And finally, Indiana, where I just came from. I would have had pictures, I just took some today, so that's where I've been from 8 to 5 today. But it made sense to replicate the study locally because I was already doing it. So I'm already in Indiana. I know the people here, I know the culture, so it made sense to just go ahead and do it here. However, I do have a limited budget that I'm working on here, which makes the site selection a little more challenging. I want it to be close. I don't want to have to drive someplace super far away. So that limited the number of sites that were available to me. And also, there's simply a limited number of places that do this kind of reuse of treated wastewater. So I had to find those and find them that were very close to me. So in order to find those, I just solicited local engineering contractors and asked them to tell me, find someone basically. I basically put out a call for someone who was going to be my key informant. I didn't know someone here. So I got on a listserv and they said, this girl's looking for someone, please connect her. And sure enough, a couple people contacted me. One of them happens to be a vendor who's very interested in installing more of these systems. He's the person that I rode around with for 9 hours today. So certainly another level of bias that gets introduced into the system when you have someone who's trying to promote these systems to communities, chauffeuring you around and talking in your ear all day about how valuable this is and how important it is to communities to be adopting these practices. All right, so I'll turn it over to, is it you, Patrick, or is it?
Just, yes.
Garrett.
Hello everyone, my name is Garrett. I'm a senior in anthropology this year. The community that I work with is in northern Haiti, and it's a rural area called the Menad. And I got involved with that community through the EPICS program here at Purdue. So I didn't get to choose that community myself, but I did have choices within the EPICS program. And so one of the main reasons that I picked the community in Haiti was I felt that being an anthropology student, I had a lot to contribute, and I had a lot of input on the design teams that work there. So I know one of the things that really helped get access to the community in Haiti was the installation of the airport, which interestingly enough is called the Hugo Chavez Airport. But that allowed my advisor, Dr. Mark Russell, to basically it's only like a 30-minute car ride from the airport to the Menad. So that worked out really well for the EPICS program selecting the northern rural community in Haiti. They identified the project through needs. Dr. Mark Russell, my advisor, had connections with Jean-Claude Pierre-Louis, who is actually the president of an agricultural trade school in Haiti, and that's our primary project partner. There have been some communication barriers, but for the most part, we worked through those. We've been able to maintain communication electronically. We email Jean-Claude on a weekly basis. We also have a lot of, not a lot, but we do have some Haitian students here at Purdue that we talk to quite frequently to understand the culture better. Blucher Analysis is a great guy, and he actually came into our lab the other day, and it's just very helpful if you can't actually go to the community yourself to kind of get a taste here at Purdue any way that you can. And that really opened up a lot of cultural doors for us, or cultural understanding. I think the next slide is just a picture. Yeah, the little red area is the Menad, and that's actually where the university we work with is. And Cap Haitian is to the northwest of that area, and that's the second largest city in Haiti. Yeah, you can see the Menad's just right down the road from there. And I'm going to pass it off to Patrick. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, hey guys, my name is Patrick. So for anybody who was here, I guess, at the workshops last last year, you would have heard me talk about my project in Cameroon. I'm currently working on this, it's a development style project. We're working on a renewable energy called a micro hydropower turbine, which is essentially just a renewable energy source. Just out of curiosity, I am a little curious about the audience here. How many people here are working on a development project or a service learning project right now, whether it be EPICS or global design teams or EWB or something? Okay. All right, and so of those who have their hands up, how many of you actually selected your project? Nobody. Okay, that's what I thought. So that's my same experience. I joined a global design team back in 2010, and my project, I mean, I've been working on this project for about 3 years now, but my project was actually already in full swing by the time I was joining it. So I guess what I'm here to share with you is some of the questions that you should be asking while you're joining a project, before you join a project, or throughout the process. I think all these questions are very relevant. So who started the partnership? All of these projects hopefully have a partner or even a stakeholder, somebody who you're communicating with on the other end. Hopefully you're not just designing for the sake of designing, or I guess implementing, depending on what your team is doing. So who started the partnership and how did they start the partnership, I think, are big questions. In some of our other workshops we'll talk about biases and certain anthropological skills that can sway the direction one way or another on how a partnership is started. Who started the project itself, so not going beyond the partnership, who actually started the project that you're working on, whether it be a professor or a student or an alumni or something like that, or when you get out into the real world and you want to do these projects, maybe it's part of an NGO. That's another important question. What are the objectives of this project and how might those change? So in a minute I'll give you some examples of my own project, how that changed over time. Why are you working there? I think that's a big question. It kind of goes back to what Dr. Nolan was saying about a personal narrative. Not only are these questions that you should be asking before or during your involvement in a project, but these are also things that you want to have prepared for when people say, oh, you're working in Cameroon, why are you doing that? What do Cameroonians have that you can provide, or what are they missing that you can provide? What constraints are out of your control and what constraints can be finessed is the term that I'm using. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And is the partnership sustainable? So based on everything that we've talked about in the workshop so far, based on what Dr. Nolan was describing and what Jonas and Anne introduced, do you consider the partnership to be sustainable? And kind of going off of that, is there a long-term action plan in place? So this is not only do you think the project will continue, but what are the next steps, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the line? And are there committed people on both sides who are willing to, remain involved in this project for such a long period of time? Okay, so yeah, as I said before, I've been working on my project since about 2010, and I guess the best way for me to kind of explain to you where I'm coming from with this is literally to just walk through these questions and kind of answer them. And actually, I'd like if anybody has questions specifically, like I know we had some questions earlier relevant to this slide, but if you just want to jump in and ask me, let me know. So who started my project and how my project was, or who started the partnership? My partnership was started actually through the Global Engineering program here at Purdue. This was, again, a couple years before I was there, before I was even aware of this project. So it was really out of my control. It is important for me to understand this just to be able to justify to myself joining this project, but this was not something that I was able to decide on. Who started the project itself? This was a joint partnership between the non-governmental organization that we're working with and the professors who are involved here at Purdue. What are your objectives? So, for instance, my objective, as I said before, is the design and implementation of a micro hydropower turbine. But this does evolve over time. So right now I'm kind of in the process with my team of transitioning from just the design of a turbine to expanding to other aspects of a power distribution system. So including the civil works, including the social impact analysis, environmental impact analysis. So things have changed over time. We've kind of met our initial objectives. There is a turbine working in Cameroon right now. Where do we go from there? How do you expand it? So that's important to think about. I wasn't aware of that when I first joined my project, but it is important to kind of project ahead and expect how things might change. Why are we working there? As I said before, the whole objective of this project is to design a micro hydropower turbine. Why isn't this being done, in central Indiana in the U.S.? Why is it being done in Cameroon? Well, that's purely because this is a village that doesn't have electrification. the founder of the non-governmental organization is from this village. He wanted to give back to his community. That's why we're working in this particular location. And I think that's a very important question to be asking. What constraints are out of your control? So kind of as Aiden mentioned, there are aspects of these projects that you need to know as you're going into them. Things like weather. For instance, my project runs on water, so rainfall data throughout the year, that's something that you cannot control, but it's something that you have to be accounting for. And its sensitivities about that have to be understood too. Other things like materials, every kind of material that you can get in the United States, you can't get in Cameroon. So understanding or trying your best to understand what's available in the local markets or in a big city are big things that you need to be aware of. Like, I can't control the kinds of metals that China is trading with Cameroon. You just have to work around that. What constraints can be finessed? Like Dr. Nolan mentioned earlier, things like communication. Communication is a huge challenge for all these projects working in very remote regions, and I have to echo his point of, like, you shouldn't be going into a community that doesn't even have cell phone access, and that preferably should have internet access. Otherwise, I don't think you should be working there. But certain things, I can't get cell phone access to my community all the time, and especially since a lot of these people are villagers making maybe $2 a day, maybe they can't afford constant text messaging. How can you finesse that situation? Well, maybe you can set up a situation whereby you and your team, or you and your professors or whoever's working on this, maybe out in the workforce, an NGO, can pay some of the text messages that they're sending back, so that you can always get a constant line of communication. Other things like, you don't have enough data in the region. The area that I'm working in is a very remote village. I'm not going to have up-to-date scientific flow measurements and things like that coming in, but maybe you can finesse that by training some of the local technicians to take this data for you, so you don't have to stay in the region for 5 years collecting flow data before you get a project going. Okay, so is the partnership sustainable? This is a question that I think is very difficult to assess when you get onto a project, but it's something that you should keep in mind. For me, the partnership is sustainable. We've been working with this non-governmental organization for about 5 years, and there's committed faculty on both at Purdue's and the non-governmental organizations, and willing to keep this thing alive. And is there a long-term action plan in place? This is something that I think I've been asking myself for a long time now. We've attained X, Y, and Z objectives. What's the next steps? And it's important to have this action plan in place. We don't, a lot of us, most of us, those who raise their hands here in the room, we have these project locations picked for us. What I recommend is that before or while you're joining one of these projects, you ask yourself these questions and assess whether the project itself is really worth joining, because if you're joining an unsustainable project, then you're not going to get very much value out of it, and I don't think the partners or the stakeholders are going to get much value out of it either. So that's kind of my advice for the general audience. Okay. Who's next?
Yes, so hi, my name is Garrett Hunt. I am also an anthropology major. And I want to talk to you about things on the more corporate side that sometimes you can get involved in, and I'm an archaeologist, anthropological archaeologist, so I'm going to talk about cultural resource management. And the key questions I want you to think about are in line with what we just talked about, is that sometimes things change on you, and your communities change. And the other key question I want you to remember and think about is is not just how you want to present yourself to your community and how that your narrative is going to reflect the community you've selected, but also how your narrative is going to encompass the communities you've chosen not to select, that will be affected directly or indirectly by your choice of choosing that community. So in archaeology, we talk about this as sort of stake claim holders. So to give you some background to myself, I've worked the last 3 years in commercial archaeology. So what this means is that engineering firms hire me to help them out navigate the legal and ethical and sort of just the logistical side of what happens when they have a project and everything's going good, and then they hit at the snag of that they've uncovered something of archaeological material or heritage value, and all of a sudden they have to deal with a community that was not their original choice community. So I worked in Canada, and so what this often means is I was working for a whole bunch of county engineers, civil projects, and so they were building a bridge, which I'll sort of jump to in this. So they were building a bridge, and it was a really big project, and so their community was the village of Puce, and then the city of Windsor was going to be affected as well. This is the community they chose to help. What they were not anticipating was that there was a massive First Nations village underneath the location of where they were building that bridge, and all of a sudden things changed very fast for them, because they now had a legal and ethical obligation to seek out the community who were stakeholders into this site. And so by stakeholder, I mean somebody who has a claim to this site, who has a cultural or a heritage or just a legal claim, are somehow invested in that, emotionally, psychologically, however you want to sort of pin it down. And these are people that you have to sort of deal with. And so, so with this, so what they hired me to do is to go and try and figure out who do they have to go and contact? Who is this new community they're going to have to choose? And so you might think it's pretty easy, right? I mean, it's archaeology, it's the site, everybody's dead, theoretically, who's part of this site, right? So you might think, okay, well how hard can be to work with the dead? They're a pretty cooperative community. But the problem is that this is not always the case, is that you have a lot of different countering communities that might seek claim to this site and now might seek claim or seek to become a stakeholder in your project. So in this example, in the Puce example, we had to figure out which First Nation we were going to contact and bring on board with this project. And so this became a problem because from the material that we had collected, it was not clear whose identity and whose nationality we were dealing with. And so then came the question, who are you picking? Is it because they're geographically close to the project that you're working with? Is it because they're cooperative? And this is a problem because the closest geographical group was neither likely to be lineage connected because they were actually displaced from the US during the Civil War. And they were also not very cooperative, and this was becoming a problem. And so we had to look for a different community to engage with about these issues. But that doesn't mean you get to not include the first community that you've been talking to just because things got difficult. There's this legal and ethical obligation. And so now in your narrative, you have to explain why you've chosen to go out to a different community. And there are other communities that you might not anticipate deciding that they should have something to do with your project. For example, we had another community that was like miles away from this project that thought that they deserved a right to be involved with what was happening here because in their cultural perception, that land was connected to them and those people were connected to them. And so we had not anticipated their interest, and our narrative was in trouble because we had to explain to them now why we didn't connect to them and why we were unlikely to sort of follow up with them. And this was a problem because when your community starts to come to you before you come to them, you don't get to set the stage right away. And this is very problematic because now you might have already created bad ties. You might have created these rifts. So in this case, the community that came to us were very angry already. So that's a lot of pain already that they're bringing to us that we didn't know that we created and that we have to deal with now, and it's not on our terms. And that's something that I want you to sort of remember from sort of the message that I want to throw out there, is that these are things to just sort of to think about, is how these things can change and throw a wrench in your plans. And yeah, is there any questions about that?
I feel like you're somehow like giving a narrative of how, like, for instance, like you're connected to a history of colonization, and that there's not a way to disconnect yourself from that. And I feel like you're sort of trying to figure out a way to make that better, but I don't know if you can.
But you're going to have to try and find a way, because you can't ignore these people. And this is true of archaeology all over the world. It doesn't just have to be in the cultural resource management sense. If you even want to do an academic dig, who are the people who attribute themselves and believe that they have a stake to this? And you can't always necessarily mitigate it well. There will be people that will get upset, and it's trying to figure out how to incorporate them as best as possible the project can occur, because the alternative is you have to shut down the project. Which, if you've already invested money, which the bridge project had, then no one wanted to do that, and there was this corporate pressure, and so it was trying to mitigate between all these forces. But yeah, it's a colonialist framework that you are dealing with, and that is tricky, and that's something so you have to think about, is that you are an outsider, and you are going to be perceived one way or another. And you can try to control that perception, but it's going to be affected by a lot of things, including whether or not you chose them or whether or not you chose not to choose them.
I think this is why I was placing so much emphasis on this idea of relationships with people as the way to get these projects done, because you're absolutely right. In the two examples I gave, in this example, in every one of these examples, there is a global structure and a history which informs everything. And you can't get rid of it. We can't change the past, but we have to figure out in various ways how to deal with it. So in West Africa, I wasn't French. I never colonized these people. They didn't care about that. I was a white man, and I was an outsider. And so they perceived me in a certain way through the lens of their historical experience, and I knew that. I was very aware of that. When we went to Russia, it was even more complicated because some of the Russians were very desirous of getting to know Westerners and making connections with us, and some of them were hardcore, diehard Stalinists who didn't want anything to do with us. And we had to figure out in each case, who are we dealing with and what is their historical framework for all of this? And your sort of example is the same. I don't think there's any one right way to do this, but boy, you put your finger on the essential problem. Yeah, it's there. I don't know if anybody else has confronted that in the experiences that you've had. But you know, you've got an identity, whether you like it or not, and you're part of historical context.
And I understand, I mean, like, I don't think there's like a magic answer either. It's just that I feel like in this project, there's like one way to value things like the bridge as like this, like as something with a dollar figure with it,
Yep.
and then like other people are valuing it based on their like ancestry, and it's really hard to like find that, well, like how much is the bridge worth, you know, in that sense of like, is it dollar worth or?
Well, this is where we get into that risk, you know, that what good are you doing with your project, and what are the risks that you may have thought of or have not thought of. How is your project going to affect people positively and negatively? So in this case, this was going to have a lot of positive effects, and it was going to be quite vital to the Puce village, which is, you know, modern, mostly white community, and the city of Windsor, which are their own community. So this Aboriginal community, the Aboriginal communities have not been really thought of until it became a problem, until their heritage appeared, and so it's tricky, and you have to sort of weigh these things. And at that point, things were in that danger of it's too far gone. So now it's how do you mitigate something and make it feasible, but also how do you just try to reduce that damage that you could do in your project? Because sometimes that damage won't be obvious until it's already too late, and you have to take sort of responsibility for that. Is another thing I really want to sort of nail out in choosing your community.
Yes.
Yeah, yes, you're good. Good.
Doesn't
The other side.
Okay. Well, I'm Ale, and I work in urban Guatemala with trans women, so trans people that identify as women. And I have worked with this community before, and I'm like currently working on starting a new project with them. So how I started working with them was I moved back to Guatemala. I'm from Guatemala. So I'm like really not that creative with my at least like area choice. I moved back to Guatemala last year after college, and I knew I wanted to work with something related to sexuality, and eventually I decided I wanted to work with something related to arts. So how I got to this particular community, which is called Remo Trans, it's really pretty much by chance. So I called people I knew, and I told them, well, I have like this minimal experience working with trans people and like sexual diversity. I want to work more. I want to get more involved. So like they started connecting me with a lot of people. So through this, I started working with big organizations. So I work with the UN. I work with a national organization called Organización Mirna Mac, which is an anthropology organization, and I work with the UNAIDS. So, and I work specifically with trans issues. So the trans female community right now in Guatemala is involved in a very strong political campaign to try to get gender identity law, which implies that they want their gender identity recognized by law. So they want to change their gender officially and legally on their documents. So because of this, I was involved in a lot of work with the different trans communities in the country, which involved interviews first, but also just like a great amount of like bibliographical research on just the status of trans people and like the situation of trans people in the region, not only in Guatemala, but like in Central America and in South America as well. So in working with these communities, I started starting to get in contact with the two main like trans women organizations, which are like Red Trans, which is like my main informant, I guess, like the person is with me in the picture, and All Trans, which is the other trans female communities. As it turns out, these communities hate each other. So they had like some like drama in the past when like someone like said something they shouldn't have said to the other like person in charge, and they don't talk to each other. And it came to the point where like if someone like if say like the UNH was giving money to All Trans, the other group would refuse to like even like get involved with like UNH, because so it's massive amounts of drama. So that really made it pretty much really easy for me to like this to kind of like end up with a single community, because I started working with one, and by the time I started like trying to like get involved with the other one in like a deeper like way, they had already heard that I was talking to Red Trans, so they were like, I'm sorry, but like we don't want you anymore. Which was really sad, because the population of trans women, especially in like urban Guatemala, is like really small. It's really not that large. But yeah, I would work with them like almost like throughout the year while I was working with these like bigger organizations. So I had built like some amount like of rapport. Like I knew the members. I like knew what they want. I knew like what their political campaign in general of this was. So I knew I wanted to continue working with them. So I'm also interested in the arts and like in visual anthropology. So in like, and so I put like live narratives in the PowerPoint, but that really isn't set in stone yet. So I know that something visual would probably be really useful for their political campaigning, so like to just increase the visibility of the group in the country. So I've been talking to them about whether they're interested in this, if this is something that I've just like imagined, or is this actually something that they are interested in. And at least now they seem to be like very interested in this type of support for their political like fight, right? So like a visual thing. So I'm in the process of communicating with them to see really to what extent I can push this I can like fit my ideas to what they are actually looking for, and to what extent I can like use the things I want to do with visual anthropology in a way that helps them, and that like actually like provide them some tools. So it's not just I don't want to be just like go and I don't want just to go and be like, oh, this is what we're going to do, but I also want to work with them. So like work with them, giving them the tools that I want to use in visual anthropology for them to like create their own images, like create their own like videos or audio, or like other audio visual things that like can like support them, right? So the idea is that I will like work, like I will create images with them and workshop images with them that will both serve like my purposes, academic purposes, and like their like political and like personal like needs.
Hi, I'm Maddie. I'm a master's student in anthropology, and I'm interested in working with transgender children and their families. And unlike the other people who have spoken so far, I haven't picked a field site. I'm very much in the process of choosing a community and choosing where exactly my fieldwork will be carried out. And in doing so, my choice is going to be dictated by my research questions, which are also still very much in development. But what I end up asking, it seems kind of cyclical, because what I end up asking will have a lot to do with what's available to me. Aiden mentioned the Institutional Review Board, and because I'm interested in working with children, children are an at-risk population, so the kinds of questions I'll be able to ask and the access I might be able to have are very much dictated by the research ethics that the institutional review board deems to be necessary to the research I'd like to carry out. So in that regard, picking a field site and picking a community gets very complicated. So what I'm considering, as I'm also forming my research questions, is the location of where I might find the community of transgender children and their families. I don't know that I would necessarily consider my choice of community to be spatially defined. And so when I'm going about choosing a field site, what I'm keeping in mind is places that might offer resources for these people, and how I might get access to those places that offer such resources. So for example, I'm considering a major city in the United States that would allow me to access a reasonable amount of people so that I can answer some of my research questions, and also a location that might allow me to have access in general. So the places I'm considering have a number of health institutions that I can use as a stepping point for networking, so that I might be able to reach out to people because they are drawn to institutions within a particular city rather than them already existing there apart from these institutions. Things I have to consider in choosing a field site are largely dominated by funding. Most of my research will be conducted in the summer, so I don't really have a lot of time to be in the field, and that will be limited. That will be additionally limited to what kind of funding is available to me. So I have to keep in mind travel, how I'm going to get from place to place. So somewhere that's closer might be a little bit more feasible for me. How I'm going to pay for that transportation, like to and from, how I'm going to get around once I'm in a city. And then what the boundaries of the field site are, because I might want to expand to multiple major cities, and that becomes very complicated very quickly because it might not be financially feasible. And then I also have to consider lodging once in the city. So these are things that I have to keep in mind as I'm composing my research questions, because I don't want to ask questions that I can't answer because I have these constraints on my research. So it's kind of a different perspective for you, something that's still very much ongoing.
Alright, so my name's Aiden, and I'm going to talk to you today about choosing a community and project in the U.S. And so a lot of anthropologists typically study outside of the U.S. as kind of the stereotype, but there are a ton of anthropologists that work in the U.S. as well, and that's what I do. And so for my thesis project, what I'm working on is I'm looking at lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender and queer healthcare services at the Purdue University Student Health Center, also known as PUSH. And so when I started looking at this project, trying to develop it, I had a general idea of what I wanted to do, and that was looking at cultural competency in LGBTQ healthcare, but at an organizational level, because we know from the statistics that the delivery of healthcare services to LGBTQ people across the U.S. Are pretty bad. Like the experiences that people are reporting are pretty bad. And so I wanted to look at maybe what are individual organizations doing, and how are they interacting with LGBT people. And so this project could be done in the U.S. It could also be done outside of the U.S. and some European countries as well. But so that's one thing I had to narrow down. First, am I going to look at the U.S. or am I going to look at an international context? And one thing is personal safety concerns. So I am transgender. I'm transgender identified, and my legal name and the name I go by are not the same. I haven't changed them on my documents yet. My gender marker on my driver's license is an F, and I do not look female. And so while it's not inconceivable for me to travel, it can be interesting to travel outside of the U.S. And I thought, well, it's not necessarily something I want to deal with for such a short project, because this is a master's project, so it maybe lasts a max of 3 months. And also funding availability. It's really hard to get funding for a master's project in anthropology. It takes more planning than I had already done at that point. And so I came to grad school in Indiana. I'm in Indiana. I'm at Purdue. So my boundaries became Indiana. What can I do in Indiana? And so I looked at my background. I said, okay, so I've got some understanding in student affairs culture. So I know how universities interact, at least the student affairs side of things. So student affairs is anyone who's, I mean, professors can be part of student affairs, but it's usually people you interact with, like financial aid, health services, those sorts of things. And I also have network contacts with Purdue University student affairs people, as well as Indiana University student affairs people. And so I thought, okay, what can I do with my background? So I thought, okay, I can work with the Student Health Center, either at Purdue or at Indiana University. And this was somewhere late fall, and I was thinking about this, so I thought, well, I've already worked with Push on several projects. I've interacted with them. Let's see if they kind of match the criteria that I'm looking at. So what I was looking for in a community partner was what I call an organization that is quote-unquote ready for change. So there's some sort of institutional commitment to LGBT healthcare, LGBT friendliness, as they call it. So Purdue had been on a track for the last 5 years to improve its policies for LGBTQ students, and Push was falling into line with that. Also, there was an alignment of organizational goals and attitudes, which means that there were people within Push that were indicating a readiness to work on LGBTQ issues and had been for years already working on these issues, and that they had been doing it kind of at an individual level. And Push got a new director in February, and she was pushing very hard to change policies for LGBTQ students in healthcare. And so that's how I knew that the goals and the attitudes of the organization were ready, indicated they were ready for change. So also looking at stakeholders' risk, because in a lot of states, people who are LGBT identified can be fired legally for being LGBT identified, and you can be in Indiana, but the caveat is that Purdue has a non-discrimination policy that protects people from discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation. So I knew if I talked to people who worked at Purdue about, one, how they identify in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity, and their opinions of people based on gender identity and sexual orientation, that even if there was some sort of breach of confidentiality that I couldn't control, they couldn't be fired because of that. So I knew that they were protected. Also, I was looking for an opportunity for reciprocity, so I didn't want to just do a research project and my findings say that, wow, there's some good things happening in Push and some bad things happening in Push, the end. I wanted to give back to this community organization, back to Push, and find a way to help them improve their policies for LGBT healthcare. And also, I was looking at what do I represent to the organization. So I didn't want to come in looking like an activist who had an agenda that said, oh, everything here is wrong, we need to work on everything. I wanted to come in looking like a trained researcher as a resource of information that they could rely on, and also as a community advocate. As advocating for Push to Change, I was also advocating for LGBT people at Purdue to have health services that were friendly. So all those things kind of combined together. It's really subjective. Those things combined together and made me realize that Push was a good site for my project. And so I didn't really have a research question pinned down and a project design pinned down until I had selected my community organization, which is kind of different than what Maddie was talking about, where she's talking about how they're going to intermix and how you're developing a research question first, and kind of how you select your site. Well, I selected my site first, and then I'm developing my final research question. And so all of that designing depended on the goals of the organization. So why did they want to improve healthcare for LGBTQ people? Was it just that they wanted to get approval for certain grants or for an assessment saying, okay, Purdue gets 5 stars on this, or were they looking for some sort of change that was, some innovative change that was really looking to impact the health of LGBTQ people? Also, what expertise exists within the organization? So am I starting from square one where I'm having to talk explicitly about what is LGBTQ in the US, or do they already have some background knowledge where we can just move on? And it turns out that quite a few people in the organization already knew about LGBTQ issues in the US, and so that gave me a better starting point for my research. Also, what resources are available in the organization? They have a large budget, they have a small budget. Push has a pretty healthy budget, and so that means that they can invest in things like training for LGBTQ healthcare, improvements in marketing to students about how friendly and how good their services are to LGBTQ students. It also means that they can invest in other health communication strategies like posters, maybe it's putting a fresh coat of paint, whatever makes the organization appear more friendly as well. And also, my research relies on something called participatory action research, which means that I'm not coming in as a single researcher saying, all right, I'm going to assess everyone and then I'm going to make recommendations. It's more of like a community-based research where I'm going to come in. I am doing interviews, but I'm bringing my reports to these community members that work at Push, and we're saying, okay, here are the issues. You're the expert on Push. What do you think? What are the solutions, in your opinion? What should we be doing about this? And so I chose to do that model because there were people in Push who really were and are invested in this project, and they want to be active in making change in Push. And so that seemed to be the most logical model for my project. So that's how I chose Push, and that's how I chose my research project. All right, and Jonas is going to come talk to you now.
Okay. Well, I'm doing research on the topic the migration of Liberian refugees from the West African country of Liberia, which you would see right here, to Ghana via Cote d'Ivoire, which is the Ivory Coast. And a lot of these people, they migrated from Liberia to escape a very brutal civil war to go to Ghana. And their culture changed quite radically in Ghana. And they nowadays return into Liberia. And I hope to communicate some of what I'm finding out to different UN agencies who administer refugee crisis. There are a lot of reasons why a civil war breaks out, some of them very local, some national, some global. Sometimes we're complicit as to the question of history. But once such a crisis has unraveled, there's a lot that can be done to make it a little bit more bearable for refugees, and not understanding anything about why they migrate to places and how their culture changes oftentimes makes it a lot worse. And I hope as an anthropologist I can translate some of that knowledge to agencies. Also, when refugees return back home, oftentimes they stay in their native country of Liberia. But the UN oftentimes says that a refugee crisis, by definition, is over once they're back home. But there's still a lot of stuff that's going on, so I hope to communicate some of that too. How did I get involved with that project? It's actually going on for a long time. In 2007, that was the first time I went to West Africa, to Ghana. I worked for CARE as an intern, and I just traveled throughout Ghana and to one of the neighboring countries, Togo, to write the organization's annual report. At that point in time, I was always very interested in the topic of extreme poverty. I kind of looked at a lot of the cultural components of extreme poverty, especially how people look at it through the lens of religion. And I wrote a paper about it, and I just became really interested in anthropology, which is why I then applied to go to school here. But I did a lot of stuff in between 2010. I arrived here at Purdue, and became clear that I had to find some kind of like really specific project. So I went back to Ghana through a German grant, and I traveled a little bit through Ghana, and I ended up in the central region, which is just about here, I think. Yeah. And there was a refugee camp called the Bujumbura refugee camp, and they had some kind of religious revival movement going on to cope with the past. And I became very interested in that. And so, I kept going back there, and I had to negotiate my way into that refugee camp because governments oftentimes try to get observers out of refugee camps because there's a lot of stuff that's going on, like corruption, mismanagement of resources that were supposed to be for refugees. But somebody allowed me in, provided I would have a police officer next to me at all times, which, I thought would be a problem, but he was very well respected in the community, and he opened up a lot of resources and context to me. And I became friends with a pastor, and I got an invitation letter, so it seemed like it was all really easy. But then when I came back here, the IRB asked a lot of questions. They're very somewhat uncomfortable about the idea of doing research in a refugee camp. But in the end, through a lot of work, we got the IRB approval. I went back to Ghana, and all of a sudden in Ghana, they said, the Ghanaian authorities said, no, we don't want some other person in that refugee camp. There had been some political struggle in the meantime. And I had to appeal to the Ghanaian government to get into the refugee camp. And I think that was more of a bureaucratic process, but it's something that wasn't necessary before. I think there were lots of reasons why all of a sudden that became necessary. So after a couple of weeks, I was allowed to enter the refugee camp. And a refugee camp is kind of an artificial distinction, so I could do some research right outside of the refugee camp. But then after a while, I was allowed to enter the refugee camp. And I got to know a lot more congregations, a lot more people, a lot more refugees. The refugees never really had a lot of trouble talking to me, but there were lots of institutions that thought I was more problematic. I organized my accommodation through a friend in the capital city of Ghana, which is called Accra. And then I went back to the US, and I continued, I stayed in touch with a lot of people. More and more people told me, well, you know what, things are better in Liberia. We heard the economy is doing better. We heard it's safe. We had a lot of questions about that, but we're going back to Liberia. And so a lot of the people that I was working with, they went back to Liberia. And I decided that I should complete my research project by looking at how they reintegrate into Liberian society. So I wrote a lot of grants. Finally, I got a grant to go to Liberia. I had to do a new IRB. It's expensive to go there because the country is seen as a post-conflict country, so you don't get a lot of flights there. And I went there and did a lot of research last summer. It was very interesting. Accommodation was somewhat challenging. I had to sleep in different places, like once with somebody who worked for the World Bank, at another time with Chinese migrant laborers, then with a Liberian family. So you always have to kind of play it by ear depending on with whom you want to talk. I was mostly confined to the capital city. I will go back next year and I will do more research on the countryside, because people told me nobody really has any trouble integrating back into life here in Monrovia. But where people really have trouble is on the countryside. Their culture's changed way too much. They have a hard time fitting back into the rural communities. So that's why I want to do my future research. So this is kind of like, for anthropologists, almost typical that you start out with an interest, you go to a community, the community changes, is in flux, that then again changes your research project. You sometimes follow communities when you work with migrants. And it's not, it sounds like there's been a lot of change, but that's not that untypical for a lot of anthropologists. So in these discussions between engineers and anthropologists, we thought a little bit about what we could all learn from this. And one thing that we always emphasize is to think more about potentials for reciprocity in selecting a community. Kind of look at it as a give and take. Sometimes it almost seems like engineers are a little better at that. In West Africa at least, people sometimes say, oh, we really like the volunteers, but we don't know about those researchers. They're constantly snooping around, asking questions, but nothing ever comes out of it. And we don't think that way. We think we want to make an impact, but we hardly ever leave behind a pump or something along those lines. So I think that's really something to think about. What is a practical kind of reciprocity? We all have to think about what's in it for the community, not for ourselves. It's not only about degrees, grades, publications. There also has to be something for the community. But that doesn't mean that all of these communities, they're just like homogeneous. They all have the same interests. Each community stakeholder has their own interests and priorities in the project. And sometimes these priorities might be reconcilable with your project, and sometimes they might actually not be. And the community's response to you is dependent upon how they perceive you. That's why you have to be careful about the narrative when you enter a community. But just by default, you coming from one of the richest countries in the world, from a really resourceful university, is going to influence how people see you. And I think one thing that we all concluded would be really important in every project is pretty much enabling long-term collaboration. A lot of anthropologists, they do that by saying, we will work with a community cultural anthropologist for at least 1 year, and then we stay in touch with those people when we do a postdoc or something along those lines. And I think, based on the engineering projects that I know, one that seems to be very successful, many of them are successful, is one. But one that really struck me as very successful is Patrick's, where he enabled a lot of long-term collaboration with the community. He got in touch with them. He went there. He stayed in touch when he went back to Purdue. He, enabled continuity through a lot of semesters, and then he came back, and then he stayed in touch. So I think we all have to think about how we can communicate with people while we're off-site. And are there some ways to communicate virtually? And I think that might be very important for a lot of engineers, because you always have these daily technical challenges that you have to discuss with somebody. Are return visits possible? In our discussions we said that's really something that should be encouraged, not just one, just parachute into that community at one time and then you get out again and never return. But even if you only go one time, how else can you signal commitment to the project? How else can you signal kind of an authentic commitment that you're going to stick with that project for a long period of time? I think the next slide was...
Oh, yes.
Patrick, right?
Okay, yes. So, this is important to consider, kind of going off of what Jonas said. We're not shopping for communities, so these are communities, kind of going back to my previous slide, we're talking about situations where there needs to be a partnership that's developed, there needs to be a long-term sustainable collaboration with end goals and I guess relevance when you're thinking about selecting a community, or as students, when there's a project that's continuing, selecting which project is appropriate. Community work has risks and benefits, as we've seen. I know my project, for those of you who have heard one of these presentations in the past, you're always going to have hang-ups, you're always going to have constraints. There are going to be times when you need to sit down and reassess completely whether or not the partnership or the community that you're working with is sustainable at all. And at that point, you really need to have a deep discussion with either your stakeholders or whoever's in charge on your end, and think about where the project needs to go from there. But of course, the benefits for successful partnerships are, they pay off huge dividends in the end. Partnership is not the only thing going on in the community. So investing in a community beyond just the scope of your project, this includes getting to know, as Jonas said, and Dr. Nolan was alluding to, is getting to know the cultural aspects of the community beyond just what's relevant to your project. So I made a reference to what kind of materials are available in Cameroon. Well, nowhere in my reports are you going to find, you're always going to see things about what materials and what kind of weather conditions are in Cameroon, but you're never going to see anything about what religions are going on or what food is locally available. But those are things that you need to be considering to make a project that's sustainable and culturally relevant. Communities are not blank slates. So there were things that went on in the past. Again, as Dr. Nolan said before, it's important to recognize what projects have been successful in the past, what projects should be successful in the future, including your own. And your project will affect how the community engages with future projects. So you really are an ambassador for your university, your community, where you're coming from, or your country that you're representing. So it's important to, and also just development work in general, or if you're not working in development, kind of as Aiden is doing, he's the face of Anthropology for, PUSH. So it's important to, follow through and give good consideration to what communities you're working in. And not only are you selecting the community also selects you. It's really up to the community how, how culturally acceptable your project is, I guess just a personal anecdote, again, I've been working on my project for about 3 years now, but the first prototype that we invested in was basically completely rejected by the non-governmental organization that I'm working with. So it's a point like that where we go back to the bullet point number one, we're not number two, the community work has risks and benefits. That was a huge risk, and it failed in the end. So it was a point like that when you have to sit down and reassess what's important in your project work and where you need to be investing time and energy. So that's that. Okay.
Great.
I think that's it for us. Yep.